was to cover the histories that have opened up, that have come together to form the history of World War III. So in 2016, Daniel 11 opened up, and we would call 2019 this waymark, not yet known as a date, but we knew what was coming was the Battle of Raphia. And following that would be the Battle of Panium. We understood that Raphia would be a victory for the King of the South, or Russia would win at Raphia, and then the United States would come back and defeat Russia at Panium. So that was our original understanding of Raphia and Panium. So what has then come to explain this relationship between Russia and the United States that leads to Raphia has been these histories of the breakdown of Alexander's empire, but particularly as it relates to the First and Second World Wars. So we've combined both of them to bring them into our time. I feel some people may have been confused by this history of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So I just want to refer you to a couple of things you can look at to understand that. I'm going to erase this top portion and just leave our application. In the history of the Afghanistan Civil War, we understand that the Mujahideen, they were local fighters that fought on behalf of the United States. The United States armed them, equipped them, trained them, and then when the United States left Afghanistan in 1989, they left all of those weapons, all that training, all that infrastructure with the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen then formed themselves into the Taliban, and they came back in 1996. They took over the government of Afghanistan. So the Taliban is not a terrorist organization. They were not, it was not the Taliban that launched an attack on the World Trade Centers. Separately to the Taliban rose Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization and headed by Osama bin Laden, and it would seek protection from those Middle Eastern countries. Some would provide protection for them and some wouldn't. And Afghanistan chiefly supplied protection to this terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda. The Taliban did not engage in that terrorist activity itself, but it provided land, a place to stay for Al-Qaeda. The two stories we're taking them from are the story of the Third Diadochi War Python equals Al-Qaeda. Former ally Mujahideen became more powerful, Python became more powerful, and then overthrown. But then we took Python equals the Mujahideen. And then separate to that, that's the Third Diadochi War, is Python, the Mujahideen, the former ally. But then we come to the Black Hand. Black Hand were never an ally of Austria-Hungary, mortal enemies. They formed as a terrorist organisation to fight against Austria-Hungary. So there's a distinct difference between Al-Qaeda and the Mujahideen. Now, if you were to search, and it's only recent information and I haven't had an opportunity to read it, but I would refer you to it, is what is known as the Afghanistan Papers. We know the war in Afghanistan has been going for 18 years now. It never ended since 2001, and it's widely known to have been some type of disaster. So there was an investigation conducted by the United States Defense Forces, a top secret investigation. I do believe it began in 2014, but I need to double check that. And what they wanted to see, what had gone wrong in Afghanistan, that they're still there 18 years later and no closer to victory than they were before. So they launched this top secret investigation into what went wrong and how that war has been conducted. And in only the last few weeks, I believe finally released on December 9 of 2019, so only the 9th, December 9 this month, though that investigation, that top secret report, was finally accessed by the Washington Post and released. And one of the things that, though I haven't read them thoroughly, one of the points that that investigation concluded was that when the United States went into Afghanistan in 2001, they were going in to take out Al-Qaeda. So in 2001, they're going in to take out Al-Qaeda. And the mistake that the United States made is that they started mixing up Al-Qaeda with the Taliban and thinking that they're one and the same thing. Or at least while they're in there taking care of Al-Qaeda, why don't they just wipe out the Taliban entirely, not just remove them from power, but stop them being able to in the future gain power. So they turned the Afghanistan war from a war that was originally about attacking Al-Qaeda to a war that was about taking down the Taliban. Two separate concepts. And when they decided to make this war about destroying the Taliban, they made that an impossible war to win. The Taliban is so integral to Afghanistan society, it cannot be easily or simply removed. And they haven't found it possible to remove the Taliban. So that's a mistake, one of the main mistakes they made in the Afghanistan war. So what I wanted to do was discuss our dispensation, and I said before we closed, I wanted to bring us back to this point that this history, as much as we've got all this information on our whole reform line, it's this history of 2014 to 2019 that is our dispensation. So it has special characteristics. One of those characteristics is that I would suggest it bookends. Do we know what I mean when I say bookends? If you had a set of books and they tend to fall over, what you would do is you'd get something solid on one end and something solid on the other, and you'd hold them up and they'd hold your books up. It's really just like a phrase that means a point of beginning and a point of end. It encloses that space or period. So I want to discuss this history of 14 to 19 in the context of the Battle of Raphia. So we know it's New Year's Eve, 2019 has wrapped up, so we know that whatever we've expected from the last 3 years, this Battle of Raphia has completed. And we know we've gone through those histories. We haven't gone back to Daniel 11, but just the Diadochi Wars and World War I, World War II. Just those wars to try and explain what we're supposed to, what we expect to see at Raphia. And we listed the characteristics of Raphia. There would be information war, but it's centered around proxy wars and spheres of influence. So as we discuss the spheres of influence that have been fought over this year, I want us to work our way through some of them. Beginning from the earliest one that I would have to mark would be Venezuela. So we understand in the Cold War, and we talked about this before, in this Cold War history, what made the Soviet Union the king of the South was its power over spheres of influence or satellite states. When the deadly wound is inflicted and it starts to die, it just starts to lose its grip on those satellite states and spheres of influence. Those satellite states being Eastern Europe, but it wasn't just Eastern Europe. It was also spheres of influence. It was also Cuba, Guatemala, these other countries as well. countries within the Middle East, Afghanistan, etc. It wasn't just Eastern Europe. So to be wounded and die is to lose its sphere of influence, then to win in 2019 is to gain control over spheres of influence. And the first one that we could mark this year in 2019 is Venezuela. Venezuela has been in a revolution for much of this year. Began in January with some major protests, and I'm just going to read a few different quotes to tell us of that history. The 2019 Venezuelan protests are a collection of protests that have been organised since January 11 as a coordinated effort to remove Nicolas Maduro from the presidency. So Maduro is president of Venezuela, and who wants him removed? So in Venezuela you have Maduro, and you have the opposition, Guaido. So Maduro is propped up by who? And he's the president, and who does the United States want in? So this has been a source of tension between Russia and the United States for some time, and it reached a climax in January of this year when these protests to remove Maduro began, and the United States was speaking in favour of the opposition. This is Bloomberg News, January of 2019. In 2 weeks, Juan Guaido has become the international symbol of Venezuelan revolt, projecting the image of a steely and inflammable operator. But his out-of-nowhere rise is due in large part to his mentor, the former opposition leader, Leopoldo López, who from his living room has unified and orchestrated the movement despite a house arrest that bars him from politics. The head of the Caracas polling firm Data Analysis says, at this point, I don't think you can separate the two, they are the same. So Guaido is the head of this opposition movement, and he has a mentor, López. In March 23 of this year, Russia sent troops into Venezuela. March 23, officials from both Russia and Venezuela have confirmed publicly for the first time, saying that Russian troops have entered Venezuela to provide military consultations. The remarks came 5 days after photographs showed nearly 100 Russian servicemen disembarking from 2 military planes in Caracas, stoking concerns in Washington that Moscow was increasing its support for Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. Asked to clarify the nature of the cooperation, Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said, military contracts, military equipment, military hardware. He said that Russia had contracts to deliver special equipment to Venezuela. So in the early months of this year, it was widely expected that Guaido would take power in Venezuela. Maduro was looking more and more weak, and his presidency as completely untenable. And then in March, Russia sent troops into Venezuela along with military equipment and hardware to prop him up. At the same time, United States sanctions were crippling Maduro, which equally looked like he would be removed. And this is a quote from the Washington Post. Maduro confronts a crisis, Russia's footprint in Venezuela grows. Venezuela has the world's largest known oil reserves, with transport and sales of its thick crude long dependent on chemical thinners purchased from the United States. After Washington barred US companies from selling them to Venezuela in January, Maduro faced a dire predicament. Their oil industry would collapse. Like manna from Moscow, an answer arrived in the form of a red and black tanker, the Serengeti, that loaded a cargo of thinners off the coast of Malta before arriving in Venezuela on March 22. The company that chartered the vessel, Russia's state-run oil giant Rosneft. So on March 22, Vladimir Putin sends a tanker through to Venezuela with paint thinners to enable Maduro to continue producing and selling oil. The next day he flies in 100 troops with military equipment and hardware. And through this intervention, Russia props up Maduro's government, and most of those watching are now surprised that he's actually still in power. And the United States and the opposition failed to remove him. So Venezuela, a win for Russia. That's one conflict between Russia and the United States. But we spoke before that this opposition leader had a mentor, Lopez. 2019, a series of protests began. Back in 2014 was the first set of those protests. In 2014, a series of protests, political demonstrations, and civil insurrection began in Venezuela due to the country's high level of urban violence, inflation, and chronic shortages of basic goods, attributed to economic policies by the government. And this is all under all of these protests are under the leadership of Lopez. He's arrested, he's put under house arrest. He mentors Guaido. In 2019, they orchestrate a new set of protests to try and remove Maduro. So when we talk about 2019 as a victory for the King of the South in this sphere of influence, you can see its victory, but you can take that conflict back and pin it in the 2014 protests begun under Lopez, who mentored the opposition leader who raised these protests in 2019. So you can connect the beginning and the end of our dispensation when it comes to the subject of Venezuela. We'll move from Venezuela and we'll discuss Syria. Syria. October 13, Trump announces the withdrawal of troops from Syria. Defense Secretary Mark Esper said Sunday that President Trump ordered a withdrawal of American forces from northern Syria, a decision that will effectively cede control of the area to the Syrian government and Russia. Syria is just a puppet state of Russia. Some defense officials are worried that American forces could be targeted by Turkish-backed forces or other groups while they are withdrawing. Mr. Engel said that the United States should consider trying to kick Turkey out of NATO, calling President Erdogan a bad guy. I think it's something that needs to be considered, he said. How do you have a NATO ally, Erdogan, who is in cahoots with the Russians? So Turkey is in cahoots with the Russians. Syria is a puppet state of Russia. And when it comes to Syria on October 22, victory for the King of the South, Donald Trump announced the withdrawal of troops from Syria. And why does the United States want control of Syria? If anyone's watched or seen studies done on how the Syrian civil war began, what's important about Syria? Oil. If you're going to try and get oil, what's this Gulf called? Mind blank. Sorry? Persian Gulf. If you're trying to get oil from the Persian Gulf, gas. If you're trying to get natural gas from the Persian Gulf through to Europe, you have to go through Syria. And there's countries here that want to get natural gas into Europe. And two of those countries are Qatar and Iran, and those are proxies of the United States and Russia. So there's been, going back through, all the way back to 2009, this tension over which side Syria will allow to plant gas pipelines through its country, and it will only allow a country that's in an alliance with Russia to place gas pipelines through Syria. So it's become an issue over regional power and natural gas within the Persian Gulf. So when you see the Islamic State arise, in 2011 there's this civil war begins in Syria, and what Assad does, which is really clever, his jails are full with Islamic insurgents. He has all of these terrorists in Syrian jails, and once he sees this civil war arise, he decides that he's going to create a divergence, and he opens all the jails and allows all of those captured terrorists to go free. And what he does is allow a huge boost of the Islamic State, which eventually forms the Islamic State. He allows the Islamic State to form intentionally as a distraction. So instead of people uniting to remove him from power, now they have a distraction. They have to go and fight the Islamic State, even though they are his own enemies. So the United States, at the beginning, doesn't become involved in all of this. When does the United States become involved? In this conflict in Syria, Obama first sends military planes in to bomb the Islamic State within Syria in 2014. I'll just say US enters. And there's been this kind of pretext made by both the United States and Russia that they're in there to protect the world and destroy the Islamic State. And behind all of that has been covert operations to either remove or prop up Assad. So when Donald Trump says we've defeated ISIS, I can take my troops out of Syria, that's really a false statement, because one of the main reasons that the troops were actually there in the first place was to try and arm the Kurds and the rebels and see the removal of Assad. Instead, he relinquishes control of northern Syria. Russia comes in and fills that void. Quoting here, Russian military police have taken over another base, this is just recently, that was recently abandoned by the United States in northern Syria. So Russian troops just flood into northern Syria and take up all of the bases and outposts left by the United States, take control of the whole region. Just about as soon as the United States, or Trump, announced his withdrawal, there was a meeting between Erdogan and Vladimir Putin in Sochi, Russia. They sat down and discussed how they would divide up the control of Syria between themselves going forward. So Russia has completely come in and taken control of, filled this void left by the United States, taking ultimate control of Syria. So again, Syria, we can take it from 2019, victory for Russia, and pin it to 2014. Just a couple of quotes. In September of 2014, Barack Obama launched a US air campaign against the Islamic State in Syria. Russia becomes worried not just about the Islamic State, but also about the United States interfering within Syria. And in 2015, American ground troops enter Syria, and Russia also enters Syria. And the United States starts accusing Russia of trying to prop up Assad, and they deny that. But I want to release a quote from the Moscow Times this month. It says, Russia intervened in Syria in 2015 on the side of the Syrian government forces in their campaign against rebels and jihadists. So what that just said is Russia entered that Syrian civil war to fight not just against Islam, but to prop up Assad and fight against the rebel forces. Originally, conflict beginning in 2014 with the entrance of the United States into that conflict. Another area that Russia has won in this year, China. China is the largest energy consumer in the world. Russia is the largest energy producer in the world. But Russia has some difficulty being able to control that massive energy it produces because of the work of the US sanctions. So what they have done is they have built the first gas pipeline between the largest energy producer in the world and the largest energy consumer in the world. The first gas pipeline between Russia and China. The pipeline was filled with gas in October of 2019. Deliveries to China started on December 2 of 2019. And if you went to YouTube, you would see a video of of Vladimir Putin in one screen, and I can't remember his name, Xi Jinping of China in another screen as they celebrate the turning on of the tap, and the gas starts to flow between the two countries. This gives Russia an outlet to bypass US sanctions and also to work with China, who also will not be controlled by the United States. It's a massive win for China in bypassing US control. That gas starting to go through to China December of this year. A quote. On the 29th of October 2012, Vladimir Putin instructed Gazprom to construct this pipeline. On the 21st of May 2014, Russia and China signed a 30-year gas deal worth $400 billion, which was needed to make the project feasible. Construction was launched on the 1st of September 2014. So the deal is signed, $400 billion contract is signed, construction begins in 2014. Construction and contract. I want to suggest another one, Russia's relationship with Africa. Quoting, Russia makes a comeback in Africa. The first Russia-Africa summit ever held in Sochi. Two events within a period of 1 week in late October 2019 put Russia squarely back in the global scene as a major player. The first was the agreement between Putin and Erdogan of Turkey, which led to a new configuration of forces in northern Syria, making Putin a master strategist and the most influential stakeholder in the Middle East for the time being. The second was a well-publicized Russia-Africa summit on October 23rd and 24th at Sochi. It was the first of its kind, with participation by representatives from all the 54 countries of Africa, 43 of them at the head of state or head of government level, and 3,000 business and other delegates. President Putin called it unprecedented. He also said our cooperation, rooted in the period of the joint fight against colonialism, is strategic and long-standing. So you have these two events that are listed as the two events that placed Russia squarely back on the global scene as a major player. First of all, the dividing up of Turkey. The dividing up of Syria with Turkey, and the second, this first Russian-African summit. Vladimir Putin calling it unprecedented. I want to quote here from an online article. It says, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Africa was a neglected area for Russia in the 1990s. There was a change in this situation in the new millennium with, on the one hand, Putin coming to power, and on the other hand, the resurgence of Africa. Given Putin's global leadership ambitions, it was only a matter of time before Russia started engaging in a significant way. The real change came in 2014 when Russia started facing US-led sanctions following its annexation of Crimea. She needed new markets and business partners. Russia was also aware that all major powers and emerging economies had a notable presence in Africa, which by then had become the fastest growing continent on the globe, with a population of 1.2 billion, huge workforce, and an economy of $9 trillion by 2050. So Russia and Africa, any networking between them really collapses after the fall of the Soviet Union. Once Putin comes to power, and you can actually mark 2013, he starts to interact, but what they're saying is the real catalyst came in 2014 when, because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the US placed sanctions on Russia, and he needed to open up new markets. So it pins it back to the sanctions of 2014. And in this history of 14 through to 19, it gives an account of how Putin has begun to work with African leaders. Ukraine. Ukraine is an interesting one. We know that we connected all the way from 1989, through this history, 14, 18. It's a consistent thread that whenever you have this conflict between the King of the North and the King of the South, it somehow involves Ukraine. And where Ukraine is interesting is that it actually becomes a major part of both the war on the Eastern Front and the war on the Western Front. We know the role that it's played in leading to the impeachment of Donald Trump, but also how those events also played into the hands of Russia. So I would like to, I have a quote here. This is from ABC News. It says, "Who reaps the rewards of Donald Trump's chaos in Syria and Ukraine? Spoiler alert, it's Vladimir Putin." In the last month, Donald Trump has triggered chaos in both Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Middle East, Syria. So all of this time, whether it was post-1989 through 2014, Ukraine has been able to muscle up to Russia because it has behind it the power of the United States. If it wasn't for the big, powerful United States standing behind Ukraine, Russia could just sweep it away. It's always been able to count on the United States to prop it up and defend its interests. This is what this article is talking about. These actions seem unconnected, Syria and Ukraine, but deliberately or not, massively benefit Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin has learnt during his 20 years at the top of Russian politics that finding enemies to attack is the best way to stay popular. The pinnacle of this strategy was in 2014, when Putin used Russia's military might to invade Ukraine. So again, we take Ukraine back to 2014, the invasion. Vladimir Putin's approval rating soared within Russia when he invaded Ukraine. Trump's first helping hand to Putin was in the form of a phone call with the new Ukrainian President, Zelensky. So we haven't gone through the war on the Western Front and what led to Donald Trump's impeachment. But if we were to do that, we would discuss the history earlier this year when when Donald Trump called Zelensky, and he started, really he has two subjects that he wanted Zelensky to investigate. So behind Ukraine stands the power of the United States to protect it. And what Donald Trump said to Ukraine to their new President Zelensky is, if you want my protection, if you want my military funding, you have to do two things. First of all, you have to investigate 2016 election interference. Second, you have to investigate Hunter Biden. And he's working for Burisma, a Ukrainian company. So these two are both conspiracy theories. Donald Trump has two conspiracy theories that he wants to be investigated and promoted that would defend his image. The first one says that Russia didn't interfere with the 2016 election. Russia didn't hack the DNC. That was Ukraine that hacked the DNC. That's a conspiracy theory that Russia created to cover their tracks, and Donald Trump supports. So he wants the president of Ukraine to launch an investigation into his own country, a conspiracy theory that his own country interfered with the American election. That's his first request. The second request relates to the 2020 election. It's quite likely that in the 2020 election, Donald Trump's opponent will be Joe Biden. Joe Biden has a son, Hunter Biden, who worked for a Ukrainian company. Again, Russian conspiracy theories are that Hunter Biden engaged in corruption with that Ukrainian company. So Donald Trump has two conspiracy theories, proven conspiracy theories, that he wants the new Ukrainian president to investigate, or he will not send the military aid. This is what they call a quid pro quo. You help me and I'll help you. Really, it's more just like an open threat. He had nearly $400 million of aid that was to go to Ukraine, already signed off, ready to go, that would expire on September 30 of this year. If Donald Trump hadn't sent it to Ukraine by September 30, that agreement to send aid to Ukraine just fizzled out. It expired. Nothing could be done about it. The aid was gone. Literally nothing could be done. So Zelensky knows that he has up till September 30 to publicly announce two investigations that hurt his country, that are based on conspiracy theories, or Donald Trump won't send him the aid he needs to fight against Russia. And why why this article is stating this is a massive win for Vladimir Putin, I'll quote. So how has this helped Putin? Putin's 5-year war in Ukraine has been an attempt to isolate its neighbour and prevent it from joining the European Union. Weakening the Ukrainian government is an important part of this goal. And while the White House's release of the phone call transcript has led to an impeachment investigation and severely damaged President Trump, it has also caused problems for Zelensky. His approval ratings are down for the first time since he was elected, and details of the phone call have damaged his relationship with the EU at a time Zelensky was hoping to take steps to join it. Zelensky has been weakened both at home and internationally, has now indicated an openness to striking a deal with Vladimir Putin. So now Zelensky has approached Vladimir Putin, he's open to making a deal, and he's now doing that from an extremely weak position. Everyone knows that they cannot count on the aid of the United States in this deal-making process. We take Ukraine back to this invasion of 2014, but I also want to mark Hunter Biden. He worked for Burisma in Ukraine. He began to work for Burisma in 2014. His contract extended from 2014 and expired in 2019. So whether you're talking about Ukraine as the invasion or this conspiracy theory that led to Donald Trump's impeachment, which is a separate thread, Hunter Biden and that work in Burisma connected to Joe Biden, the Democratic opposition, it still bookends 2014 to 2019. want to discuss one other. There's also been a proxy war going on over Libya. Now, Gaddafi was overthrown in 2011, and who had him overthrown? Hillary Clinton, through the working of the CIA, overthrew Gaddafi. And how did that make Vladimir Putin feel? About as angry as any article or report has ever been found on him. Libya was a sphere of influence of Russia, and Hillary Clinton sent in the CIA and had the head of their ally overthrown and killed in the streets. Vladimir Putin was furious, and in 2011, we mark that year as setting. Many things are set begin in 2011 that lead us through our dispensation, but this overthrowing Gaddafi was one of them that set Vladimir Putin on his tracks to this open hostility working against the West. So recently, just in September of this year, it was understood that Libya is in a situation of civil war, and that civil war ignited in 2014. And in September of this year, Russia, who has taken a side in that civil war, sent in the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group is a technically illegal, but under the sanction of the government of Vladimir Putin through his oligarchs, it is a group of Russian mercenaries. I will quote, "When Russian mercenaries linked to the Kremlin emerged on the front lines of Libya's war in September, their military expertise and advanced weaponry changed the battlefield. That was only the beginning. Their arrival to help Eastern warlord Khalifa Hifter, started a chain of events that has escalated a battle for the Libyan capital of Tripoli and threatened to fuel a regional war over geography, ideology, and lucrative oil and natural gas reserves. Now more than ever, the conflict in Libya is being driven by the Middle East's latest divide, pitting the United Arab Emirates, Egypt and Saudi Arabia against Turkey and Qatar. The United States, after years of neglecting Libya, is now scrambling to find a way to blunt the Kremlin's reach. But in the absence of strong US diplomacy and policies, Russia and Turkey appear poised to exploit the security and diplomatic vacuum and control the fate of Libya, as they have done in Syria. More than 1,000 Russian mercenaries are said to be operating in Libya, according to US and Western officials and top Libyan commanders. Most work for the Wagner Group, a shadowy private army linked to the Kremlin and Russian President Vladimir Putin. It has also fought in Syria, Ukraine and other nations that Moscow considers strategic to its interests. The Kremlin denies any relationship with the mercenaries. Hifter's self-described Libyan National Army says it deploys only Libyan fighters, despite clear signs of the mercenaries' presence. As the war has intensified, so has hate speech, disinformation and fake news, as both sides seek to use propaganda as a weapon. It is dividing tribes and communities and fracturing efforts at reconciliation. Concerns are also growing about more refugees fleeing violence, spilling across borders and attempting dangerous sea journeys to Europe. And remnants of a once-defeated Islamic State affiliate are looking to take advantage of the instability. Russia hopes to regain billions of dollars in oil and military contracts it lost when Libyan dictator Gaddafi was ousted and killed by rebel forces in the 2011 Arab Spring revolts and NATO intervention. To Moscow, Libya is also a part of a strategy to extend Russian influence across the Middle East and Africa. So when you mark this win, this victory for the King of the South, for Russia, it's not just in one country. As it dissolved and died, it wasn't in one country, or even just Eastern Europe. It was across the world. It was losing countries that it had influence over. So now when it's been rising up from 2014, emphasizing this year, it's taking countries across the world going into alliances with many governments in Africa, signing strategic contracts with China, oil deals, Syria, Venezuela. It now has all of the leverage over Ukraine, and now we're marking Libya. And this civil war again, everything bookends our dispensation. If we mark it here, we can bookend it here. The protests of Lopez led to the protests of Guaido in 2019. US enters Syria led to this. The contract and construction of the pipeline, finishing of the pipeline. The sanctions against Ukraine turned it to Africa. The invasion of Ukraine, now it has all the leverage as it comes to make a deal, and they've started sitting together to make that deal. We connected Hunter Biden, Burisma. The civil war in Libya, it's taken control of the situation within Libya. On all these different levels, we've seen, as one of these articles we read, I can't remember which one of them said that Russia is now asserted itself in 2019 as a global player. I want to just read from one final newspaper article before we close. I believe this is, I think this is the Washington Post. How Putin built a ragtag empire of tyrants and failing states. Even in the worst of times, Russia has been a reliable friend to the Sudan of Omar al-Bashir. When the International Criminal Court indicted him in 2009 for genocide, Russia went its own way. Instead of detaining him when he landed in Sochi in 2017, Putin received him at his official residence and put the meeting on state television. As it turned out, Russia's enduring friendship was about to pay off. The outlaw president had arrived with an offer. Sudan, he told Putin, can be Russia's key to Africa. What he wanted in return was protection from aggressive US actions in the region. The evidence shows Putin took him up on it. The leaders' talks opened the gates to a flood of Russian ventures in Sudan, from political consulting to mining and military aid. As Russian geologists began drilling for gold near the banks of the Nile last year, the Russian armed forces drafted plans to use Sudan's ports and air bases as military outposts. Sudan is just the start. Over the past few years, the Kremlin has once again been scouring the world in search of influence. In troubled countries overlooked since the Cold War, Russia has been forging new alliances, rekindling old ones, and wherever possible, filling the void left by an inward-looking West. The Russian campaign reaches from major conflict zones such as Venezuela, Libya and Syria to the more obscure corners of the world, to Sudan. What comes through is a newfound Russian willingness, even an eagerness, to involve itself in wars and cultivate regimes anywhere Moscow sees a chance to assert itself. But unlike the Cold War, when the communist East competed with the capitalist West as equals, the new contest is being waged in an altered war. Yet Putin has managed to keep Russia in the global picture, punching far above its weight through a combination of opportunism, bluster, and common cause with isolated despots to whom Moscow offers weapons, protection, and respect. Maduro in Venezuela has survived US sanctions thanks in part to Russian cash and political cover. In Syria, Russia rescued the dictatorship of Bashar Assad with a military campaign that forced the US to abandon its hopes of ousting him, while boosting Assad's only other friend in the world, Iran. And in the complex war for control of Libya, various factions have sought the Kremlin's support, often in exchange for access to oil fields and other resources that the US also covets. They are specifically targeting countries that have toxic relations with the West, says Andrew Weiss, who studies Russia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a think tank based in Washington. They're trying to deal themselves into any conflict they can, not because they're going to solve it, but because they want influence, they want to have a voice, they want a sphere of influence. The agility of the campaign has caused some caught some Western officials off guard. Last year alone, Russia made major arms deliveries to at least 23 nations. It won the rights to build logistics hubs on the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. It has struck major energy deals over the past 3 years with Turkey, India, and Iraqi Kurdistan. Russia even brought the Taliban to Moscow last year to try to broker peace in Afghanistan. One afternoon in late December, a rights activist in Sudan was on her way to a demonstration in Khartoum when she came upon an unusual scene. A Russian-made military truck stood on the side of a road near the demonstration. The incident only began to make sense a few weeks later, when the Times of London reported that Russian mercenaries, the Wagner Group, were helping the regime put down a popular uprising. What began in December as a series of protests against the rising cost of food and fuel has since grown into a revolution intent on ending al-Bashir's 30-year reign. The White House now referred to Russia as a great power. That suits Vladimir Putin just fine. It bolsters his image at home and it has cost him relatively little. John Bolton said the US still sends more than $8 billion in aid to Africa each year, much of it to help fight AIDS and other diseases, and China plans to spend $60 billion over the next 3 years on infrastructure. But Russia has built relationships without building much of anything. No highways, bridges, hospitals or universities. Instead, the Kremlin focuses on wooing elites, warlords, generals and presidents for life, whose personal desires are simpler and cheaper to satisfy than the needs of their people or their economies. Russia's hard power, including armed mercenaries, is more worrying to the opposition movements. What we're seeing now in Khartoum are Russian mercenaries, and that's the last thing the country needs right now, says Eric Reeves, a researcher at Harvard who has studied Sudan for 20 years. Russia has for years used private mercenary outfits for its strategic missions abroad. Their first big test under Putin came on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, where these loose formations of volunteers, ex-convicts and veterans helped the Russian military seize control of Crimea in 2014. So if you want to talk about Russia using mercenary fighters like the Wagner Group, you can take and pin it. They started their first major test of this strategy was again 2014. Russia did not always advocate for an end to the order defined by the West. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, we tried hard to fit in with the globalized world. Vladimir Yakunin, an old friend and colleague of Putin's from their time in the KGB, told Time magazine. But it was naive to assume that the family of civilized nations would really integrate us. The resulting sense of exclusion came to a head in 2007, when Putin gave a landmark speech in Munich to an audience of Western statesmen. He told them that the rising strength of Russia, China and other developing nations would soon end the American century. That speech was not about Russia baring its fangs, says Yakunin. It was a prophecy that unfortunately the Western leaders failed to heed at the time. But it's Russia that's building a foreign policy around respect for rogue regimes, without judgment of their actions. Russia offers its new friends a powerful weapon, its veto in the UN Security Council, which has been used to block at least a dozen Security Council resolutions on chemical weapons use, war crimes and ceasefires in Syria alone since 2011. Other nations have taken notice. In Africa, 18 governments have signed military cooperation deals with Russia since 2015. At the same time, Russia is seeking to forge a reputation as a peace broker, especially in areas where the US is seen to have fallen short. The Taliban, for example. The West has lost in Afghanistan. Russia's special representative, Zamir Kabulov, told reporters after the talks, "The US has had enough time, 17 years. We don't need that kind of leadership." Apart from money, Putin also has a reputation to protect. In Syria and other parts of the Arab world, As well as in Africa, Latin America, he is a bulwark for autocrats, the man who will defend his allies' sovereignty no matter how much pressure they face. This, above all, explains why Russia has created for itself an empire across the world. There's a reason the world's dictators are lining up to sign cooperation deals with Russia. So it's not just these 6 countries. Across the world, wherever there is a country that has trouble with the United States, Russia is quickly integrating himself. For one example, Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. They are known as the easternmost front of the NATO alliance, and they've also always been an ally of the United States. And since, again, Turkey, Erdogan was Prime Minister of Turkey from 2003 to 2014, and in 2014 he should have resigned, because you can't serve a further term as Prime Minister. Instead, he made himself not the Prime Minister, but the President of Turkey. He remade himself under a new job title so that he could stay in power. So from 2014, you have Erdogan rising as a dictator. This is Erdogan in Turkey. And from 14 to 19, he's taking a dictatorial control over Turkey and changing its allegiance from the West to Russia. And in 2019, one of the most contentious disputes between the United States and Russia this year was Erdogan's decision to buy advanced S-400 missiles and air defense system from Russia. The first missile batteries, which were part of a $2.5 billion deal, were delivered in July this year, the second delivery being made in September. Erdogan, becoming president in 2014, has changed his country's allegiance from the West because they keep interfering, and changed it to Russia, who does not interfere to the same extent. So when we talk about 2019 and the Battle of Raphia, we have all these other histories, World War I, World War II, Diadochi Wars, to fill in all of this history and explain to us the steps that have led us to Raphia. We understand what Raphia is meant to look like, the characteristics of war in our time. These information war between 2 superpowers, also engaged in proxy wars over spheres of influence. The King of the South wins at Raphia 2019, and all we've done is taken the spheres of influence that they've been quarrelling over, usually from 2014, and show how in 2019 on each front was a victory for Vladimir Putin, to where the United States government now calls him publicly a world player and a superpower. This is Raphia. This is the victory for the King of the South. If we're following what prophecy and parables teach us about what war looks like, we are content to see its accurate fulfillment. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you that you give us just cause for our faith. I pray, Lord, that we will have faith, that we will trust the parables, the methodology that you have given to us as we see them demonstrated and fulfilled in a way that even the world is wondering after. Just as the world wonders at the resurrection of the papacy, so the world wonders at the resurrection of the King of the South. This year, Lord, the world is wondering as Vladimir Putin across the world has won in so many spheres of influence, recreating his own form of the Soviet Union. Lord, we are grateful that we can see in prophecy these things laid out. We know in the future we have more to understand. I pray, Lord, that you will be with us, that we will have a deep trust in your leading, that through these things we will trust in your leading of this movement. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.